Hey there. Today's podcast is all about Disney history, why it's important to preserve it, and what's so much fun about looking back at past attractions. Brian P. Miles of the Retro Disney World podcast is here, and you're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 58 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. When I think back to what I loved at Walt Disney World as a kid, some of those attractions are still there. You have things like Spaceship Earth, Space Mountain, Pirates of the Caribbean. There's a lot of examples of things that have survived. But on the other hand, many attractions are gone, particularly at EPCOT Center and at the former Disney MGM studios. And it's tricky for Disney to not just cater to nostalgia, but also to still be interested in what the fans think. And that's a big question that I talk about today with Brian P. Miles of the Retro Disney World podcast. That show is looking back at our memories and at Disney World attractions and other things. So there's an easy thought to say, wasn't it better back then? In some ways it was. In some ways there's amazing things now. I found it interesting talking to Brian. He's not in the camp of just saying things were always better because the audience changes, the Disney company changes. It was really interesting to dig into that with someone that is focusing on preserving Disney World history and even has a new nonprofit with the other Retro Disney World hosts, the Lake Buena Vista Historical Society, that is doing just that. So we cover that and a lot more interesting topics relating to Walt Disney World's past and how it's changed over the years. So here is Brian P. Miles.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'll deliver my trademark greetings from Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love.
Excellent. I feel privileged now. I'm here in St. Louis, so from across the country, basically.
I have never been, but it's on the list.
It's a fun city.
I want to go see the spot where Walt was going to build Disney World in St. Louis.
Yeah, I guess I've been there because it's just on the riverfront. But I couldn't tell you that I would say, here is the exact point, where it would be, because it's so different now. I am excited to talk with you because I mean, you get what you guys do. I've been listening since the beginning on the show is basically cover a lot of the attractions that I love, but also kind of the odd things that I know absolutely nothing about, which I enjoy a lot. But I want to go back to kind of how you got started and got into theme parks. How did you get interested when you were younger in Disney World and going there?
My parents surprised my older brother and my younger sister and I Christmas 1987. Christmas Eve, they handed out a box to the three of us, and we opened it. And it was a little packet inside from a local travel agent saying, you're going to Disney World in next month. And so the end of January 1988, the only vacation I ever took with my parents where we got on a plane and flew to another place and stayed in a hotel. Our vacations growing up being from southeastern Pennsylvania were always at the New Jersey shore, in our case, Ocean City, New Jersey. So we'd go down every summer and rent a house for, 1 week or 2 weeks, or as we got older, it was half the summer, and would go to the beach and the boardwalk, and that was my only experience with vacations. And so that trip was, my recollection is we went to EPCOT first, and that left a permanent impression on me. EPCOT in 1988 was just about at its apex.
Oh yeah,
of Epcotness. And I came back from that trip and was determined to go back someday. My parents certainly weren't going to take us. It was a once in a lifetime kind of thing with them. And so a couple of years after I graduated from high school, I saved some money with some friends and we drove down in one car and stayed at the cheapest places we could find and ate the cheapest food we could find and lived a Spartan existence for the week. But we spent a week in Universal and Disney. That was in 1995. And I was like 21, something like that. So it was, and then kind of ever since tried to get there. Back then it was like about once a year I would try to make the trip, and it's been more frequently since we started the podcast. Usually once a year as an adult.
Yeah, well, you mentioned that you hit in 88 as like the Epcotiest. 95, I think you snuck in right before the World of Motion closed and before Horizons was totally going on a Journey to Imagination. It was still a pretty good time.
I'm going to lose my Epcot card because if I recall correctly, World of Motion was closed. We were there the middle of January, and I want to say World of Motion closed right when we got there. If it hadn't, and I think it was, but if it hadn't, it was down. But I actually have almost no memory of riding World of Motion because I rode it, as far as I know, one time in 1988. So I watch it, and there are a few scenes I remember seeing, but the overall ride, I had until we did our 2-part episode where Hal took us exhaustingly scene by scene through the ride. I really didn't remember a lot about it. You know, for me, the ones that stuck with me more from that trip were Spaceship Earth, Horizons, and Imagination. Those are the 3 that I most kind of remember from that first trip.
Yeah, well, those are 3 great ones, obviously.
They are.
But why do you think, you mentioned how much it really stuck with you, even though you didn't go for a while after that, but what was it about Epcot that attracted you so much to it when you went those first few times?
At the time, there was no place else like it. And you can't say that now. I had this kind of spiel a few years ago when Epcot, they were changing more things and taking more things out of it, Universe of Energy, and people were really upset. And I went on this kind of soliloquy, both on Twitter and on our podcast, about how when Epcot was built in the 80s, there really wasn't another place anywhere where you could go and immerse yourself in this, futuristic stuff and kind of that edutainment, learning about things, but really just energy and the land and all that kind of stuff you learned was really neat. And the museum experience back then in wherever you lived was a lot more sterile. Mannequins and, farm implements on display from 150 years ago and stuff. And what's happened is the Epcot effect, and I'll happily call it that, on museums as they began to either be built or renovated in the 90s and 2000s. Most of your local science museums, whatever region of the country you live in, some city near you probably has a science museum. They're doing the kinds of displays and stuff that Epcot used to do, that all those Epcot pre and post show areas, independent of the rides, used to teach you about in interesting and fun ways. So much of them. I mean, around here, it's the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. But there's the Liberty Science Museum up in New Jersey. And when we started talking about it on the show and on Twitter, everybody kind of chimed in from around the country with where near them there was a museum that kind of did something like that. But in 1988, the reason it left the impression was because you went there and, like I said, you saw things you never saw anywhere else. The largest aquarium in the world at the time, which is not anymore. The Atlanta one ended up being bigger than the Living Seas. But at the time, the Living Seas Aquarium was the largest in the world. And so things like that you walk into and you just, I got to see them, you would see news reports about manatees. And right there in Epcot, they had a manatee rescue tank and you could see them swimming around. You can still see them today.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. And that's a good point because I think about, I went to Epcot first in 84. I was 8 years old. And I remember the same way, just being like, what is this? Like Spaceship Earth, first thing. And there was no internet. There was no YouTube videos. So I had no idea what we were in store for. Compared to this, like now we have the St. Louis Science Center, which my daughter's 9, so I take her to that all the time. And they have a lot of interactive exhibits. They have a giant OmniMax thing where they show educational films and such. So to that, it's a big deal. They had a small science museum when I was a kid. I remember being so amazed that when you pressed a button, like the caveman thing lit up. And that was like the biggest deal ever. So yeah, I remember when you guys did that, you put like a list together of all these science museums. And it makes me a little sad because I think it's great that all these science museums are out there and they've expanded and they've taken on more of an entertainment to the education. But I look at EPCOT and I know things change. I look at some of the attractions and I'm like, yes, I understand why. I just wish there was some way they could balance it out a little more. You know what I'm saying? Where like we still had, I mean, they do have some of it. The land is still a great pavilion. Spaceship Earth has its moments. It's just there's a few areas, and I don't want to turn this into like complaining, but it's more, I just wish they could do a little bit more going forward.
I think the people like us are a minority. And we miss the Epcot of old and that stuff that it used to do. But I think as much as Epcot has changed, more often than not, what happens is these theme parks, after their initial construction, they adapt to the guests and the thing, because ultimately in the end, they need to sell tickets for people to come. People don't want to pay $120 a day to come and learn about farm techniques or you know, the salinity of the oceans and how it affects this fish. And you know, when you can do it for $20 or $30 back home or less in a local museum, even though it's not maybe the full Disney experience, it's just not the experience they want to get out of their theme park. I have a friend of mine whose brother is one of the top chefs in the country. And this is a complete aside, but kind of to the point. One of the things they were talking about healthy stuff on the menu, and he told her, he said, "Listen, people don't want to eat healthy when they go out to eat." And he said, you know, there's all this pressure to have these menus where, you know, there's healthy choices. And it's not what people order. And he runs a very high-end restaurant, one of the most expensive in the country. But, you know, it's a point that he makes. And I think there's a degree of truth to that in the consumer of today. 1980 was different. The other thing that has changed is when we were growing up, you had a set of encyclopedias that you could refer to. You could buy books or magazines about a particular topic and learn about it. But the idea that you could say, I want to know how rubber bands were invented and how they make them. And you and I can today, anybody can open up their computer and watch a YouTube documentary on it.
Right.
We read copious articles, learn the history of the rubber plant and when they turned it into bands and what they were first used and made for. But in the 1980s, you couldn't do any of that stuff without writing a thesis on rubber and spending months waiting for periodicals to be delivered to your library. It was a task. And now all of that information, that including stuff we learned at Epcot, is available instantaneously, which is one of the things that Epcot was teaching us was in the offing. I mean, in Communicore, in the Spaceship Earth, you know, those early communication and technology-based pavilions, they were telling us, you know, in 20 years, the whole world's going to be at your fingertips. And they were right.
That's a perfect example because you guys did your podcast episode on the Age of Information exhibit at Communicore, which is silly and goofy. And you watch it and you're like, oh, I love how odd that is. But beyond the silliness, goofiness, and the fun theme song, they are making points about exactly what you're saying about the future age of information that we're living in. Some of the things they brought up, they were more spot on than anyone probably thought when they watched this little show back in the 1980s.
I remember and I think I said this on our show, but one of the things I remember my dad telling me was that, you know, because we moved from the city to the suburbs in 1984, and the city city of Philadelphia didn't get wired for cable television until like 1988 or 89. It took forever. It was obscenely expensive. But so when we moved to the suburbs, literally the day we moved into the house, my dad had the cable installers there. And I remember him telling me in the latter half of the 80s one time, in the future, everything's going to come out of the phone jack. The phone company is going to be giving you your cable and your TV and all that. It was something he had read somewhere. And of course, today, the growth of that, or the outgrowth of that prediction or business model, is now our cell phone companies are also our entertainment providers. You have Comcast and you have Verizon and around here, and they deliver your cable, they deliver your cell phone service, they deliver all your voice and data wiring, and all that comes from them. It's just interesting sometimes because at the time it sounded goofy, like, oh yeah, the phone company's going to tell us what to watch on TV, sure.
It's funny to think back because having kids, I'll explain to them something about phones, and I try not to be like when I was a kid or whatever. But sometimes you sound that way because they'll say like, "Well, Dad, when you were or was everything black and white when you were kids?" Like, no, there was things, it wasn't that long ago. But it is kind of crazy to explain to somebody who grew up with smartphones or even with the internet how different it was, and I guess it's a testament to a lot of the things that were at EPCOT that were so in front of it, even kind of weird things like video phones and how you would reserve reservations at Earth Station for dining and some of the things there, or the World Key Information System that at the time, which weren't exactly touchscreen and weren't exactly as neat, but they found ways to show future technologies that didn't even exist yet.
Well, and you also, when you were doing it at the time in 1982, 1984, even 1988, you felt like you were on the moon in some futuristic colony. I mean, and it's so simple now when you look at it, like the technology is so basic compared to what we have today. But you're right. I talk to people I consider peers who are 15 years younger than me, and you try to explain. I mean, I'll give you one example. We're talking about 9/11, and how common it was that a lot of people still didn't have cell phones then. The idea that like you just pick the phone up and either text or call somebody and make sure they're okay. And you're like, well, no, that person, like it would have been bizarre for them to carry a cell phone around, and now, 15 years later, even like the internet in the late 90s, I think people assume now your memory gets skewed, but back then, like we used to access the internet by calling AOL and dial-up, and using their web browser, and the web pages were terrible and clunky, and like you would never spend hours on it. Like that was crazy. Like it was like a fun thing you did for a half an hour at night. You checked your emails and you might chat with somebody in instant messenger or something, and so it's just the notion that a theme park would invest in keeping up with the rapid changes that have happened in communication and technology. There's almost an unreasonable factor to it where it would require so much investment. I think that coupled with the fact that it wasn't really a number one guest desire, conspired to make EPCOT for a while kind of linger in between two worlds. It was kind of half a place you learned about stuff and half a place where you went to ride a fast car and fly in a hang glider and soar and stuff like, it was an identity crisis that now they've settled on what they want to turn it into. They haven't exactly shared that with us, but clearly there's a plan over the next 10 years to kind of transform what the park's all about.
Yeah. And I mean, right now they just say kind of things like more Disney, more family, more. It's like, okay, I don't know what that means, but it's okay. Well, I'm sure they will tell us probably more next summer and down the road. But I want to circle back a bit because I know you guys on your podcast, and especially on the website with all of your, vintage films and slides and stuff, you're really looking back kind of the early days of Disney World. So for you personally, what interests you about looking back kind of at that time or even at the history of the parks and the other areas around it?
Well, there's a couple of things. From a personal standpoint, I was there for 3 or 4 days in 1988 with my parents. We lost my father in 2004, but my visits there are still moments where I am at a place that I was at with my parents and my brother and sister, and it is just burned in my brain. The memory's so thick you could wipe them away. I don't have that experience a lot of other places, but there are just places we stood, places we ate, things that we said to each other that for whatever reason, probably because it was such an anomaly from the rest of my life, that I remember. So there's a personal connection. And when things change, like downtown, the Lake Buena Vista Village becoming downtown Disney and then becoming Disney Springs. I had all these memories of walking around down there with my parents and going in and out of the shops. And of course, all that's gone now. There's a tendency as these rides and attractions disappear, as the stage shows disappear, as the hotels change, to kind of nostalgia is a very, very powerful drug. Maybe the most powerful one out there because, remember when is an easy conversation to have with people you don't know very well. And so when you start to reminisce and talk about remember when, it naturally connects people. And so I went to EPCOT 30, which was a D23 event in 2012, which is 6 years ago now, and instantly connected with this community of people who also had an affinity for EPCOT the way that it was. And then from there, obviously, you start to discuss the rest of Disney World that you loved and things that aren't there anymore. And, with the exception of the Magic Kingdom, which there's a lot there that hasn't changed so much. Some of the attractions have changed, but the layout of it, a lot of the nooks and crannies of the place still feel the same. Epcot, there have been a lot of changes. Disney MGM Studios is virtually unrecognizable to a lot of people from what it was when it opened. And so there's a whole community out there that loves that park. So, there was a natural tendency to interact with people who had a like-minded love of the way things used to be. And through that, you start to learn and you share things that I was a novice 6 years ago. Other than knowing what I personally saw, I didn't spend a lot of time reading and studying Imagineering or anything like that. And so it's really been through conversation and then starting to restore these films and slides and stuff where sometimes we come across stuff and then we educate ourselves about it so we can share it with other people. And Hal's a great resource for that. I know you interviewed Hal Bowers a few months back. Hal's a guy that experienced the parks from when they were built until now. So he has a lot of firsthand knowledge. And so he's usually our first stop when we come across an image and say, well, what was this?
I think that's good, though, because each of you, as far as the podcast itself, each of you has kind of a different time when you went. Because even I think me personally, I think the first time I went, I barely remember when I went in 1980 when I was 4, but I'm remembering mostly a little similar to you, but like mid 80s, late 80s, early mid 90s. And he is able to say, well, I was at the Polynesian in 70 something, which I have no view into that. I mean, you guys did a show on the wave machine and stuff there, which I didn't even know exist. So that's the crazy. I feel like you said, you called yourself a novice. I would say, I know a lot about the parks compared to someone in the office that I work. But there's always this other layer. And I think that's what's so crazy, especially about those first few decades. There seem to be so many layers to uncover that while you may think, a show about retro Disney World, you're going to run out of topics. I don't get that impression you guys are going to run out of topics anytime soon.
We get harangued about the stuff we haven't done yet. But no, I don't think so, because so much changed. There's this false impression that they opened the park in 1971, and the only thing they did over a 20-year period was add things without ever taking things away. And that's false. I mean, Walt certainly, the 10 years that he was running Disneyland while he was alive, opened and closed a lot of attractions and shows, tore down stuff that he had built and put new stuff in. And Disney World was doing the same thing in the Magic Kingdom and around the property from the time it opened until the bigger changes and the expansions in the late 80s and onward. There's always things that have disappeared or things that were, I don't want to say forgotten about, but dismissed at the time as minor, that now people have these strong opinions of, like, I love that particular stage show or this parade or when they used to do grad night or things like that. And sometimes I know about those things and sometimes I don't. We're very fortunate that usually there's one of the four of us who has some kind of an insight, and that kind of becomes the launching point. But really, the show developed first from Todd McCartney, who started Retro WDW, restoring movies And him and I hooked up because I had acquired a movie from the first weeks that the park was open, and he offered to restore it. And then we started talking, and he said, "Hey, would you be interested in being part of this podcast?" And at the time, I'd never listened to any podcast ever before about anything. So I'm like, all right, I don't know who would possibly listen to this, but sure. And I knew how from Twitter, but we didn't know each other. We just, we were two guys who occasionally tweeted to each other about stuff. And I didn't know JT at all, but Todd was kind of the guy that approached each of us independently about doing this. And we all kind of said, yeah, sure, we'll give it a shot. And when we started, we didn't, of course, we didn't think 4 years later there'd be thousands of people every month listening to us and that we'd be doing events. And last night we announced, so it'll be out before this comes out, but that we've transitioned a little bit from just the podcast to we formed a nonprofit, a licensed 501c3 nonprofit, the Lake Buena Vista Historical Society. And the long-term project here is to take all of this stuff that we've acquired and these interviews that we're recording, some of which have been released and some of which haven't, and to create both a digital and physical archive that lives on beyond all of us in the podcast when we're done. Because there's a lot of people who do these shows for fun. There's a lot of people who do these shows to kind of promote whether it's their travel business or other things that they do. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. That's great. But we, over time, realized we weren't doing this for any of those reasons. We were really more interested in capturing the history, preserving it, sharing it with people, aspects of it that, certainly Disney has a lot of this stuff chronicled, but they don't have a library we can go into and comb through their archives. And so our hope is over time to eventually have a physical space where all of this stuff is stored that's available to people. And that's way down the road. But it's a really exciting development. We think it's going to open some doors for us. It also means every dollar that people spend on one of our T-shirts or coming to an event or giving us money for any reason is 100% tax deductible. So we're taking the charitable educational foundation approach to this to try and make sure that it sustains long after we're gone.
I think that's great because you guys will have even something as simple as prizes for the audio, clips that you play or something like that. And you're always talking about all these things you've gathered, like pieces of history, a booklet or something like that. And that is all great. But to have kind of somewhere where either those or the information is compiled, because like you said, yes, this information is on the internet or it's out there, but it's in 100 different places. There's people that started a blog or started a podcast that talked to people and stopped. Maybe they have information they could provide on. So I think it's exciting because it is. Sometimes like I'll do something simple where maybe I'm prepping for a blog post or something and I want to read up on Horizons or whatever. And you find yourself going to all these different places, and not that you would have the only location, but to have that information together, that's exciting. And hopefully, and I suspect you'll have a lot of people already. I know you get a lot of films and such, but kind of having that entity apart from the show, you probably will get even more.
Well, yeah, the show will become the podcast of the Lake Buena Vista Historical Society. That's the transition that's going on right now. Nothing's going to change about it other than it's going to be called something a little different, have a little bumper attached to it. But yeah, overall, the idea was to have a place where people would be maybe willing to donate or write off the cost of the donation, as opposed to us always having to hunt them down. We have a backlog of films, and our slide archive is up over 9,000 now. And those 9,000, every single one of them, without exception, I have acquired, I have scanned with my own two hands. We've restored, we've labeled, we've put them together, put them in order as best we can. It's been a real labor, but we think that the images are not comparable to anything else out there, that even photos of the time have faded. They weren't that clear to begin with, but a nice Kodachrome slide We've got EPCOT. We've even got slides of Disney MGM Studios. Haven't found any of Animal Kingdom yet, but by then the image technology had kind of caught up with all of us. So there's good pictures of Animal Kingdom from day one. But so this is an exciting time for us. We've been working on it for about a year. We kind of started this conversation right after the new year last year about heading in this direction and seeing what we needed to do and getting legal advice and tax advice and going through the process of getting certified by both the state of Florida and the IRS. And so that's all done. And we're actually doing these lake and lagoon tours next month during Disney's D23 event celebrating Mickey's 90th birthday the weekend before Thanksgiving. And that's actually under the Lake Buena Vista Historical Society banner. So, we'll be doing our first event. It's like I said, it's a really exciting time for us.
No, it sounds great. And I'm kicking myself. I wish I had been able. I knew I couldn't make it, so I didn't try. But the Lake and Lagoon tour, especially on those old Discovery riverboats, which I did ride in like the first year at the Animal Kingdom, when we just happened to go that year. And that riverboat tour was very strange and didn't really work at the Animal Kingdom. But I'm more excited for your version. So I know you're not even in the same waterway. It's just the boats themselves. But tell me a little bit more about the Lake and Lagoon tour for people that aren't familiar.
Yeah, so we did this. It was actually our first event of any kind back in 2016. We had been doing the podcast for 2 years at that point. And we developed enough of a following that we felt like, hey, maybe we should do something when Disney was doing their Destination D that year, which was focused on, they called it Attraction Rewind. And so they spent that weekend kind of looking back at attractions and things of the past years that had been held at Walt Disney World. And so we scheduled for during the lunch break the one day to rent a bunch of different. I actually wanted these boats back then. I knew what I wanted, but we kept running into dead ends every time we would try to talk to someone at Disney, either in Marine Craft or anything about describing the boat we wanted. They would direct us to Sammy Duval's, who handled the water sprites and pontoon boat rentals right from the marinas at the resorts. And you couldn't reserve those boats. Like you couldn't call up and say, I need 5 boats at 12:30. Like that, you just had to show up at the dock and hope that the boats would be there. So we scheduled small groups to go on these tours with us. And what we did was we leave from the Contemporary and we take a boatload of passengers around Bay Lake and Seven Seas Lagoon, pointing out things that either used to be there, things that are there now that are of note, or things that were going to be there but were never built, like certain resorts. We show people where the wave machine used to be. We show people where there was a barge fire in 1978, which we have slides of. There's just different stuff like that around the lake. And it was a big success. We had a lot of fun with it. So with D23 doing another event this year. Last year we did EPCOT 35. We did a big event for EPCOT's 35th anniversary. But with Disney doing this 2-day celebration of Mickey's 90th birthday the weekend before Thanksgiving, it means a lot of people that listen to the show were going to be in Florida. So we decided we were going to get down to then and try and do this again with these boats, with this big boat that used to be the Discovery River Cruise in Animal Kingdom. We still didn't know how to get it. We had talked to a few people and they were like, oh, well, maybe you talk to this person, that person. And in an absolute incident of kismet, Todd and his family were down for their spring break. They usually go somewhere around Easter week and spend the week in Florida in Walt Disney World. And they're out there one night at like 8:30 at night waiting for a boat at the Polynesian. And what pulls up to the dock but the Discovery River Cruise boat, which they were using to ferry passengers. And we knew that in high crowd times, sometimes they put those boats into service because they're larger. They can hold more people than the normal water launches that run between the Polynesian, the Grand Floridian, and the Magic Kingdom. Todd being Todd, he sidles up to the captain and pumps the skipper for all kinds of information. And by the time the ride was done, he had the specs on the boat. He knew exactly what to call it. He knew who to call to book it. And from there, the rest was history. A few weeks later, we went ahead and took the plunge and arranged with Disney Events to get these boats and figured out how to do it. And so we're doing 3 tours. We're doing 3 tours back to back, one of which falls on the lunch break of the Destination D event. So we have a boatload before, a boatload at lunch, and then a boatload after, at which point I'll be tired of talking about Seven Seas Lagoon and Bay Lake for about a week.
Well, that sounds awesome. It's crazy that he stumbled upon that, because it wasn't like he was standing there trying to find it. He just happened to be there, and it's good that he jumped on it, because like you said, those boats being larger, and especially the fact that you're doing 3, I'm sure there's, from what I can gauge based on, how you're selling tickets and stuff, there's a lot of demand for it. Because not to disparage Mickey or anything that's happening at Destination D, but I get the impression a lot of fans might enjoy this boat cruise a little more than just learning about Mickey. So I think you're going to be okay.
Yeah, this is the first time none of us are attending the Destination D event. And I always try to, there's a misconception when, when I'm at a family event or with friends and like, oh, you love Disney. And I try to tell them, I don't dislike Disney. I mean, right. I see the movies when they come out once, usually. I see Moana and see Frozen and all that. But I'm not a Disney fan. I'm a fan of the theme parks. And, I don't read about the animation studio or stuff like that. It's just not, I don't want to say I'm not interested in it. I'm interested in it, but it's not something that I have a passion for.
Yeah.
The theme parks are my area of interest, and that's what I love, and that's what I love to talk about, and that's what I love to read about and things like that. That's a distinction sometimes I have to make for people.
Well, yeah, I do the same thing. And now I have kids, so I see a lot of the films more. But still, like when I saw, and I don't mean to pick on this event, but just as an example, I'd love to go to an event. Like you mentioned the one that was like an attraction rewind. Yeah. Now, if that came up, I would go in a heartbeat, just especially doing the podcast and everything. I'd be on it.
And there is certainly a segment of their audience, D23 plays to a much broader audience than just the Remember When theme park crowd. Right. And they sold this event out. It's a 2-day event, which blew my mind. They're doing it over 2 full days. And there are a lot of panels that, Mickey Mouse is such a broad canvas that you can kind of wedge him into any presentation you want to give. But I preferred both for EPCOT 30 and EPCOT 35, they did a 1-day event. And I kind of preferred that. I liked it being a nice tight event that kind of kept everything together, but didn't also eat up your entire weekend. I hope that we don't know what they're going to do. We're planning to do our own event for Disney MGM Studios 30th anniversary next year. We don't know what Disney's planning on doing, but we're pretty sure it's going to be something around Star Wars and not really anything focused on the history of what used to be a park that they kind of, I don't want to say they've erased it from existence, but they really don't refer very often to what used to be at Disney Studios or even what it was.
Yeah, because you think about it, when they do those events like EPCOT 35, yes, they're talking about a lot of things that are gone, but they still have Spaceship Earth, and they have Living with the Land, and they have other pavilions that are, World Showcases still has a lot of similar things. But I doubt they're going to do an event for the MGM Studios and say, let's talk about the Backlot Tour and Superstar Television and Great Movie Ride, which some people still are upset about. So it would seem more likely, you're right, that it might be a celebration of the movies. Star Wars,
the amazing thing about that is I would love, and I know that they would sell out an event where, just like they did for EPCOT 30 and 35, there were panels dealing with each of those attractions and constructing the park and the first shows that they had and the Roger Rabbit history and all that stuff. There just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of interest from them in doing it. And which at some points I think they maybe misunderstands a segment of their audience that I happen to be a part of.
I agree. I think it's easy to, well, especially now, because like you mentioned, you kind of mentioned the interest in Mickey, but I have such a blind spot for a segment of Disney fans, and I'm not denigrating them at all, it's more like, I wouldn't say like a lifestyle or like the what they wear and the YouTube. And I so have no, and I don't mean to sound like an old man, I'm 42, but there is a segment of Disney fans that I probably really underestimate how sizable and how impactful they are in what the company does.
I don't disparage them either. It's funny you call them. I mean, I've always seen them called lifestylers.
Yeah.
So it's funny you'd say that it's a lifestyle for them. But yeah, they spend a lot more money than we do. I'll tell you that.
Yes.
You know, they're buying the cupcakes and the T-shirts and all of that. And in the end, obviously, when you're marketing something that's for sale, you're going to market it to the people who are most likely to buy it. Look, there's cash out here to be had. There is a tremendous amount of money spent now by 40 and 50-year-old men and women and late 30s probably buying things from their childhood. And, you know, it's a foreign concept to me that there are people, grown-ups, who have these toy rooms where it's filled with G.I. Joes or Transformers or like, you know, like that. That is just completely foreign to me. Like, I just see my grandfather, my father looking down at me like, you know, grow up. My guest room here is filled with classic Disney artwork and theme park memorabilia and stuff like that. But I recognize that I live alone, so I can do that. But I don't think I would have a room like that if I had a house full of kids, because it's not practical. But when there's a segment out there that's willing to spend money on that stuff, shame on them if they're not giving us stuff to spend it on.
I want to close up. I want to ask kind of a few questions about kind of what you prefer from the past or what really interests you from past things. So here's kind of an odd question. So let's say there's an alternate universe. This is never going to happen, where Disney says, we're going to do a fifth gate. We're going to use all past attractions. For you, which ones do you want to see in that park?
Well, they're a bit at odds with each other because the first rule of a theme park is that there should be some kind of an overarching theme, and things that used to be there but aren't anymore isn't the best theme to build an environment. But I mean, obviously, I would love to see the original Imagination and Horizons. Those two from Epcot's original were the two obvious answers. I would like to see a Spaceship Earth with the Tomorrow's Child song restored to it. I missed that song at the conclusion of the ride. I thought it was the best one that they had kind of had that tied it together. From the Magic Kingdom, that's really hard because a lot of, you know, as I said, a lot of stuff there has survived. And some of the stuff I don't remember as much. I would like to ride the old Space Mountain before they put the track in that beats the crap out of older guys like me. Whatever it was, 5, 6, 7 years ago when they closed the whole thing down and put all new track inside. It's a lot rougher ride now. Kind of preferred it before it became the death rocket that it is now. From the studios, I would absolutely love to see Great Movie Ride and the Backlot Tour. Were both a barrel of fun. Those would be a good start.
Those are good picks. Yeah. I mean, the other ones for me, I mean, obviously skipping Epcot, but like the Magic Kingdom, I would think I love Mr. Toad. I know you only went a few times when it was there, and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Those are kind of the two for me.
I don't have the same longing for Mr. Toad because I know I can still ride it in California.
Right. Yeah, so. And even 20,000 Leagues, you do have the submarines, though I know they're now Nemo. I want to ask kind of a flip side of that, which is you guys often will either reference or talk somewhat about kind of these attractions that never happened, like Meet the World or the Rhine River Ride or whatnot. So you can't say the Western River Expedition because that's too obvious. But what unbuilt attraction or show or some hotel, what is something that really interests you, even just from a history perspective?
Boy, that's hard. That's really hard. I think the Space Pavilion in Epcot, I think that was a real missed opportunity that they never built that, just because we don't know. I mean, we have some ideas of some of the stuff that would have been in there. You know, that's a real missed opportunity. And the countries, the Switzerland Pavilion in World Showcase and the bobsled ride that they were going to have there that was sort of like the Matterhorn in Disneyland. just the whole Swiss village and the idea of a Swiss restaurant, I really am disappointed that that wasn't built. The German boat ride that was supposed to be built, that they put the show building up for in Germany and then never used it for that. So stuff that the World Showcase, there's just a ton of stuff I wish they had done more with. But when the restaurants fill up, even back then, the restaurants were filling up first thing in the morning with reservations, and people seemed okay with just a few attractions back there. They were parents of the 80s were snatching up exotic worldly merchandise in the in the shops, and it just became a disincentive for Disney to keep building attractions back there. I'm not excusing it. I'm just, it's just the way that it happened. And so there were some terrific attractions that were designed for there that never got built. And I never got to experience Meet the World, which they ended up building for Tokyo Disneyland. That was supposed to be in the Japanese pavilion here, but I think that would have been fun to see too.
Yeah, that one, the more I learn about it, because fairly recently on Twitter, there was like some concept art from that one in Japan that came out, and stunning. And then the Equatorial Africa Pavilion is something that I'm still kind of fascinated by how far they got with that, which was supposed to be there.
Well, and we've learned in the last few years that the film for the pavilion was completely finished. The film that they made for the Africa Pavilion is done. It's in the can somewhere that no one's ever seen it. There are some advocates on Twitter that lobby Disney every now and then to release it or at least show it at an event or something. But there's the legend of the salt mine, that Disney has a salt mine somewhere in a mountain somewhere in the western states that all this stuff is buried in, and they don't much care about it, and we don't really have access to it. So
yeah, they're holding it all for like when at some point down the road they do one of these D23 events and they just show all this stuff. I mean, how popular that would be. Insane, the popularity of things like that.
I completely agree with you. Now, I mean, I do understand in modern days, there's an expense with taking a film like that. It's finding out what condition it's in and then digitizing it, which might seem like a simple expenditure for a movie studio, but to do it for a ticketed event, for a single showing. I mean, I know what we spend to get a 16 millimeter film converted, and these things were shot on 35 millimeter film. I mean, a 16 millimeter film for us to get one small reel convert is a lot of money. We've done it a few times because the subject matter has been worth it, but it just doesn't make. I'm assuming economically it doesn't make sense for D23 to go spend like $15,000 digitizing the colors of Africa or whatever it's the movie's called, and just to show it to us once at some event that we're paying to come to. So it's cheaper to fly some guy in that worked on it and to show a couple of storyboards and have him tell you 15 minutes of stories about it.
True. Yeah. I'm sure I underestimate what would be involved with that. So I know you mentioned your event coming up, down the road at MGM Studios. Do you have anything you can tell about that, or is it still kind of in the works?
Yeah, I can tell you that there was a plan A, and we aimed for the stars for what we wanted to do. And ultimately, the show that we wanted to structure and the person we wanted to structure around turned down, after some negotiation, the offer to come and be our keynote speaker. So we're now working on plan B, and there is also a plan C, D, E, and F if that doesn't work. So we know what we want to do. We want to do something in the vein of what D23 does and present interesting panels and content, and at the same time some fun stuff. I felt like we had a really good mix for EPCOT 35 when we did that event. We had a rare character there with Epcot ties to meet people, and we had some food out, and we had a couple of Disney legends there to speak to the crowd, and we did some audio-visual stuff, and we had a recreation of the cake that had sat outside of Epcot for the 5th anniversary. So that kind of stuff, I felt like we had a really good mix and bead. MGM Studios is a little harder. There's the park itself, obviously, half of it was a working television and film studio. So we can do a panel, as we would intend to do, on the production stuff that was done there at the parks and have some of the people that were involved in it. But the attractions, it's probably the least chronicled park There's not in terms of knowing who worked on stuff. We know who worked on the stuff, but it's probably the least chronicled in terms of those individuals responsible making themselves available for interviews to talk about it and to bring that stuff to I think a community that's very interested in hearing stories about how the park, was opened and the stuff that was done to get it ready, and then the stuff that was in the parks the first few years, because that park went through massive changes the first 5 to 7 years. From a heavy focus on Roger Rabbit and Dick Tracy and stuff like that. David Copperfield was going to come and have a whole land originally, and all of that within the first, 6-7 years the park was open was just completely wiped away, and other stuff happened, and the television and film production started to dwindle within the first couple of years, to the point that it was all basically done by the end of the 90s. Very little was done there after that. And it was not on the scale as to when the park opened. So we'll see. We've like I said, we are there's no shortage of ideas. One of the things that we're waiting for Disney to actually decide what they're doing. So in the past, they released the calendar. They did it last year during EPCOT 35, which was October 1st. Since D23 weekend now isn't until the weekend before Thanksgiving, I suspect we're not going to get a preview of the 2019 event schedule until then. So we'll come back from our weekend in Florida with our fans and get right to lining up our guests and our dates and venues once we see what Disney's doing.
Well, that sounds great. I've watched the video of your EPCOT 35 event with Bob Gurr and with the whole thing, and I'm like, why did I not go to that? What was I thinking? So I'm keeping the MGM one. I'm hoping it works out with my schedule because I think it'll be awesome.
I'm only disappointed that Bob Gurr had nothing to do with Disney MGM Studios, because he's a great guest and we would love to have another event with him. But it's probably going to have to wait until we get to revisit EPCOT in 2020. And Bob Gurr's 87 or 88 years old or something like this, so it's, there's no rush.
Yeah, not at all. All right. Well, this has been great, Brian. Thanks for doing this. So if people want to, if they're not familiar with the podcast and now with the new nonprofit entity, where's the best place they can go?
So the podcast and all things related at retrowdw.com. And you can find the Lake Buena Vista Historical Society's webpage, which also links to Retro WDW, at lbvhistory.org.
And if anyone wants to connect with you, like on Twitter or something, where should they go?
Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Brian P. Miles. And I will plug the rest of the guys on the show just for the heck of it. Hal Bowers, you can find on Twitter, Facebook, and he is on Instagram at Go Away Green, and he's got a website /blog at kingdomofmemories.com. JT Kuzier, who is our youngin of the group, who gives us that 90s perspective on things. He is on Twitter at LS1JT. He's also a motorhead, so he has a website, rubbercitymotoring.com. And Todd McCartney is Mr. Retro WDW, so you can find him at Retro WDW online.
Well, awesome. I follow all you guys, but it's great because I know that while a lot of people listen, I'm sure there's others that will enjoy discovering the show. And it's been awesome talking with you. And thanks so much, Brian.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Well, that was awesome. If you enjoyed this episode, I would highly recommend you check out episode 44 with Hal Bowers, who is also a host of the Retro Disney World podcast, but it's a very different conversation given when both Brian and Hal started going to the parks. You can find that episode at tomorrowsociety.com, or you can subscribe through Apple Podcast or another podcast vendor. And if you're able to, ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts are always a big help to spread the word about the show. You can also like my page on Facebook at Tomorrow Society. I'm going to start reaching out more on that page to get some input on the types of guests you would like to hear and also specific questions or types of questions you would like me to ask my upcoming guests. You can also follow me on Twitter at TomorrowSOC or Instagram or Pinterest at Tomorrow Society. You can email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music is by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I will be talking to Dan Cockrell, the former vice president of the Magic Kingdom, EPCOT, and Disney's Hollywood Studios, about his more than 25 years working for the Walt Disney Company. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you again so soon.